name is Diedra Barber, and I'm here with Steve, Scheier. And we've recently decided to do some interviews to help people have a better understanding of the work that we do. We like to talk to each other, so figured we'd record it.
There we go.
So I have a question that's off script.
Off script?
Yeah, I think it actually might be down there, but I thought it'd be better to get off the piece of paper.
Okay, sounds good.
So Steve, I want to know, why do you even do this work?
Well, that's a it's a very good question, and I've always been interested in how decisions get made in organizations. I think that oftentimes in organizations, it's sort of a little bit like the Wizard of Oz. There's like a veneer that's placed in front of how decision making happens, and in situations that can be very, very dangerous and detrimental. And I also saw in all my experiences working in government and technology and nonprofits that unless we're really willing to engage with our teams, unless we're really willing to engage with the people that are in our group, we're not going to get as much done. I also saw that, in a very heartfelt kind of way, the lack of opportunity we're giving to people to really participate in decision making in our organizations, and how that's not good for them and it's not good for the organization. Mm-hmm. And so I was really driven by a sense of waste and wasted opportunity, and a belief that if we only can unlock the opportunities to people, that our organizations will get more done and they'll be more effective and people will be more fulfilled. And it really speaks to one of my basic philosophies in life, which is that if people would only be free, or only could feel free to be who they are and to advocate for what they want to do, we'd all be a lot better off. Too many times people feel restrained and constrained, and they are not honest with themselves and with others about what they want to do. And I think that we would be much better off if we created environments where people could speak up. Because at the end of the day, what human beings are about is so great and wonderful, and they have so much potential and ability, but that we work in organizations that are often crushing and stifling and not really providing a avenue and a process for people to really contribute in a meaningful way. Mm-hmm. So to answer your question, and I went on and on about it.
That's a very good answer.
Okay, well, thank you. The reason I'm interested in this work, the reason I'm interested in getting really granular about who's making what decisions, is because I think it is a secret point of leverage in organizations. Mm. If we could only understand these things, we would be much more able to really employ all the talents and abilities of the people on our team. If we would only let more people make decisions, they would take responsibility for moving our organizations forward in a more powerful way, rather than sitting around and waiting for orders.
Right.
That type of model, that sort of top-down hierarchical model, in some ways has its place in certain settings, but for the overwhelming majority of people in the overwhelming majority of circumstances, the more I can engage you to bring your talent and your insights into our decision making as an organization and into your personal decision, into your own personal decision making, the better off we'll all be.
Right. Nice. It's interesting because it's so not the way most folks who have been trained, through their undergraduate degrees and advanced degrees. It's not how we're trained to think about working together in the workplace, right? It's like when I first started learning decision clarity through you, and then like really unpacking it, transforming it for the 21st century, it was kind of like, wow, this just makes sense, right? It's like duh. There's that moment of duh, but it's not the choices organizations, both nonprofit and for-profit, have made in terms of their structure, right? In terms of how people are included or not included, or it's just really interesting. It's really interesting to me, and I think that's, for me, that's one of the reasons I have been drawn to this work. Before, I've always had this idea of equity and fair. Like, I've always just, since I was a kid, just have been really, really staunchly for fairness. Like, with my siblings, like, I had all brothers, and I was always the littlest one, and just didn't think certain things were fair, right? And from both, teachers and my parents, and it was, oh, well, life isn't always fair. Like, you've heard that, right? Life is, and yes, it is not. Sometimes life is not fair. I don't believe life sometimes isn't fair because that's how the universe rolls. I think life isn't sometimes fair because people let life be unfair, right? And so I actually like this idea in terms of what draws me to this work is the connection of equity in the workplace, and like allowing, because I think I agree with everything you said, and on top of all that is, at least in the United States, right, it is embedded in an American culture that has some, misogyny in there, some patriarchy in there, some sexism, racism, some homophobia, like classism, is all this stuff, geographical issues, right? There's all this stuff in just the American culture, right? Because it's not, I'm not judging it, I'm just saying that's what it is. And so you said something earlier when we were speaking about, I think it's interesting that people think that you can live your life outside of the office and then show up at the office as a completely different person.
Yeah, that's true.
That's so weird to me,
yeah,
right? It's so weird to me, right? If I'm Diedra outside of the office and I'm outspoken and I'm direct, I don't know how I would show up in the office and not be Diedra, outspoken and direct, right? And to ask me to do that means you're stifling me, right? And then there goes the innovation, there goes accessing any kind of like talent or happiness or cheeriness or what have you, right? And so with decision clarity, I like that it's this model to you say commentate, have a conversation. I say constructively confront. I think both are fair.
Yes, they're both fair.
Fair, but I think that it allows for that shift in thinking and that shift in thought to happen because it's real. Like, I think that's why decision clarity to me has always made sense, and it's real because it allows people to establish a work culture or a way of doing work together that is more realistic about the way we are as humans and the way we are in an American culture of, like, it's very diverse, right? There's different races, different genders, different sexes. We're living in a time now that we've never had in which we're not talking about factories, we're not talking about manufacturing, we're talking about offices and workspaces that have three very distinct generations working inside it, right? So everyone's coming from a different American culture perspective based on your generation.
Right.
And so the cool thing that I find about decision clarity is it allows us to actually be real about the crap that comes up for us when we're in these workplaces where, it's baby boomers against millennials, or Gen X stuck in the middle, or Gen X against millennials, or, women against men, or, how gay can you be in the workplace? Like, all this different stuff comes up in the workplace anyway, but there's no tools for us to talk about how we're going to work together, how we're going to have these conversations, because all of that comes into play when we're making decisions. When we decide who gets to make decisions or not, right? Like, if I'm a bigot outside the office, trust and believe that that's going to color when I show up in the office who I think gets to do work and who doesn't, right? Who gets to make decisions and who doesn't.
Right. And
I think to say that it doesn't is a cop-out and doesn't do justice, particularly for organizations that are nonprofit and doing social justice work. I think that if you really want to propel your mission forward, you have to be much more realistic about the people who are helping you propel that mission forward and the conversations that need to happen and the tools, like the process needed to do that work. And that's the cool thing of, like, knowing that there's something that's actually really real and tangible that I can go into workplaces and be an independent, be a consultant and hold my head up high and be like, I'm not just, walking around selling stuff out of a magic carpet bag, right? Like I'm actually showing up with tools that can actually help you guys show up as human beings together with all your flaws, with all your insecurities, and with all your brilliance and all your magnificence that you want to use to push this vision or mission forward with an actual tool and process that allows you to do that in a very real way. And that's one of the things that I just love, and go back to this idea that it allows a group of people who work together to really push to be equitable, to really push to be, when you say all voices matter, to actually mean it, right? And even when you stumble and fall and you forget and you have to be reminded of like, this is a process we talked about and we're gonna do this process, that's okay, because we're human and that's what's gonna happen. Sometimes we forget, sometimes we have to be reminded, and this process allows people to do that. And particularly in a world where more and more people are working 70, 80 hours a week, we're on our phones, we're on our tablets, we're on our computers, just working. There's got to be a better, I like that decision clarity allows us to offer a structure in which showing up at work is not a cross to bear. Where you don't necessarily have to hit snooze 15 times because you're like, oh my God, I gotta get up and go do this. So that's why I like this idea of decision clarity and what keeps me here. And then when we go into these organizations or we have our boot camps and stuff, and people show up and you see the light bulb go off, you see them like, wow, like it doesn't have to be the way that either I as the manager, or even the at the highest levels, have created, or the person who's been managed, and they're like, oh, I can suggest something else. And if it doesn't happen, I can move on, like that. But that's what I really, really enjoy about this work.
Yeah, I don't know if is it light bulb go off or light bulb go on. I'm not quite sure. But
I probably said off, and it should be on.
Well, it could be. It goes on. Well, it doesn't matter. But the and the reason that I do this work as well, just to riff a little bit more on it, is to talk a little bit more about it, is that people are often too afraid. They're too afraid, and when you come into an organization, just to break this down, so you've been competing for a job, you are trying to show how brilliant you are, you get the job, you come in, you're in an organization with 125 new people, most of whom you've never met before, almost all of them you've never met before. And what's the number one thing you're trying to figure out when you sit down in your cube or at your desk or your shared workspace? You're trying to figure out, how does this place work?
Yeah.
And you go to HR and you have your little introduction meeting, and they give you the employee handbook. And I pretty much can guarantee you that in that introductory meeting and in that employee meeting, there's that employee handbook.
Well, you're lucky if you can get that introductory meeting.
Right, but let's assume for the sake of discussion that you do, and you do get your employee handbook. Being a former VP of HR, I certainly always hope that those things happen. Let's assume that those things do happen. None of the information you're going to get in that discussion or in that handbook is going to provide you any insight into how decisions get made in this organization. And so subconsciously, at the very least, and in some cases consciously, you spend the next few weeks or few months observing how decisions get made in your organization. There is no handbook for you to receive because it's very organic, and people just let it happen. And so what my belief is that is really a waste of time. And in truth, people spend years trying to figure out how decisions get made in organizations, when if they were just clear about it from the beginning, if there was an established practice that people could point to about how we make decisions in this environment, and more importantly, and most importantly, how you can join us in making decisions in this environment, then we'd be saving a lot of time and trouble and grief.
For sure.
Right? And so these are sort of the magic things which are never discussed, that people have to figure out over time, and it's just a complete waste of time.
Right. Well, it's because I agree with all of that, and the thing is, which we talk about in our work, is like it's connected to, the ideas of trust and transparency, fear and bias. And I think those and how we individually, what our individual perspectives are of trust, transparency, fear and bias, our individual experiences, how we show up in the workplace, what our level of power is in the workplace, I think impacts our belief systems around what is possible and how we work, and whether or not you can have a workplace with high trust and you actually are transparent on how decisions get made, that will produce a more efficient workplace. And many people know this to be true, and there's many people out there who believe different. They just believe, no, like, I'm gonna beat you down, treat you like crap, and tell you you're really not worth anything, and that's gonna have you produce your best. And I think you see that more in for-profits, right? And that's this kind of, it's going into an area that we're not necessarily directly talking about, but I'll talk about it anyway. In that, one of the issues I've always had with the systems that be is that, in the world of nonprofit work, nonprofit sector has always been considered the stepchild, or the adopted, the unwanted adopted child of the business structure, right? If you were worth anything, you started a for-profit. If you weren't quite as smart, you started a nonprofit, right? And I think that is changing. I think with this new generation, that mindset is somewhat changing. But I know for mine, that was definitely when I was graduating. I graduated in school in 1996, my undergrad, and the idea of doing nonprofit work was just considered like, well, what? Because you can't get a job in the for-profit world. And it was still that in mid 2000s where I'd hear people actively say in the Bay, you go to a nonprofit because you can't get a job at Google. That's ridiculous, right? Like, that mindset is wrong, but that mindset is there. And so I think what nonprofits have done is they've tried to match some of the structures they've seen in the for-profit world in terms of how people work together, internally, and what the hierarchies are. And I think that has been to the detriment of the nonprofit sector, because the difference is you have people coming in oftentimes who are closely connected to that mission, who are closely connected to this idea, the community that this nonprofit is working for, or this idea that the nonprofit is working toward, this idea that they want to remedy. And so that changes the emotion in the workplace, right? It changes the passions in the workplace. It changes what people are bringing and how personal you take issues that come up in work, as opposed, there's a difference between having grown up homeless and very poor, and have worked your way up to be a part of an organization that's, their main focus is to remedy poverty. There's a difference between, and I'm not judging one is better than the other, but there is a difference between the impact of a dysfunctional workplace on that person, as opposed to the impact of a dysfunctional workplace on someone who shows up just to make rubber bands. But there's a difference, right? Mm-hmm. Or iPhones, or whatever, the latest technology. That's not to say the commitment that for-profit folks have to their products is that I'm diminishing it. That's not what I mean. I think that people show up and they do the best work they can, and their brilliance shows up. But in my experience, from my perspective, there is a difference in the passion or the connection, or I don't know, I can't really find the word, but the connection that you have for a lot of people who show up in a nonprofit workspace, right? They're showing up because it's something they believe in. There's even if it's guilt that brings you there, it's still a very human, deep emotion, right? Mm-hmm. That's bringing you to this work. And so I think nonprofits really rethinking how it is they want to do work together, and thinking about, obviously, we want people to think about decision clarity in the process of decision clarity, but I would say in general, just rethink how it is people are working together outside the box of the nonprofit, the for-profit model would behoove nonprofits, right? I think you would keep more people longer. You would have more talented people. I think we could open up our minds about, it would begin to open up more people's minds about the importance of it, the financial weight that should be put behind it, increasing what you pay people for this work, There's no reason that folks at Google should make more money. There really is no reason, other than as a society we put more emphasis on that, which then you see in the nonprofit world. And somebody has to push back. And I like that with decision clarity, this allows people to see it can be different. It can, when that person shows up in the office, like you were saying, shows up in the office for the first day, it can be a different experience, right? It can be what you're saying. You can be very clear about, this is your job, this is our expectations, here are the decisions you make, here are the decisions that other people make, right? That world is possible if we don't think it has to mimic or copy the traditional business world to be worth anything.
And I'd like to talk for a few minutes about the assumptions that we bring when we enter into organizations. So let's just, for the sake of, for illustration, let's just talk about, because I really don't perceive these jobs in this way, but let's just talk about entry-level jobs, medium jobs, and senior jobs. It's an artificial construct, but we'll just do it. What are the assumptions, if you're in an entry-level job, that you have about your ability to make decisions as you enter an organization? What are the assumptions that somebody in a senior level position has about your ability to make decisions? My point is that we make assumptions about the capacities and the abilities of people without really testing them. And in truth, the people, this cuts both ways. The people who are hired into more entry-level positions make assumptions based on their very real world experience about what they're going to be able to do. And those assumptions are born out of their experience and they're real. What if we were in an environment where we gave those people more power and more ability? What if we were in an environment where more senior people had beliefs and assumptions about the value that entry-level position people can bring? That would really change the dynamic in workplaces. So we really have to change our, and really question our beliefs and assumptions and presumptions about the abilities of the people we hire. And that's sometimes very difficult to do because people often feel comfortable with people who are like themselves. Mm-hmm. This is not some new thing I've come up with. This is very common in the literature, and we know it to be true. And it's really important that we open our eyes to the innate ability that other people in our environments have and not assume for our convenience or simplicity that they are without talent or without decision-making ability. Mm-hmm. They have that ability. Now, the interesting thing is that there are people in this artificial construct I've created, in entry-level positions who have been beaten down so long that they're not going to trust that they're going to be given the ability to make decisions. But if we evoked an environment where people were more opening to question who was really the best person to make decisions, that would be a much better environment for everyone. Mm-hmm. And one more thing, people often in organizations, particularly in nonprofits, often have a problem with being seen as power hungry. They think that it's something it makes them uncomfortable. It makes them uncomfortable to advocate for power. And that fear and that fear of advocacy really gets in the way of organizations because people do not want to look bad in front of their peers. In the book that I wrote and in our work, we talk about three big fears. We talk about fear of failure, fear of rejection, and fear of conflict. And these are all fears that are really rife in the nonprofit sector. People are really afraid of failure. If they are not doing all they can 24 hours a day to remediate the problems that they're trying to solve, or if their organization looks like it's not going to succeed, it's a major problem. Fear of failure is very big in the sector. Fear of rejection. They don't want to be rejected by anybody in their environment, and this also skews their decision making. And then, of course, fear of conflict. So many organizations in the sector are so proud of their consensus-based decision-making, but consensus-based decision-making doesn't often, from my experience, come up with the best decisions, and they certainly don't come up with decisions in a timely manner. So we need to look at our assumptions about who in our environment should really be making decisions, and we need to be aware of the three fears that really impede our decision making.